I'm here with Mark O'Neill, who, as you'll say in a moment, understands the back end of all of these kind of issues, and we're talking about complexity. Anyway, Mark, tell me a bit about what you're doing, and then recap on what you're doing.
Okay. As I say, I'm Mark O'Neill. I have responsibility for the online service channels which my organisation offers, but also I work with UKgovcamp quite a lot in terms of how we position citizen-centric services, which is a very important area for me, because an awful lot of the services my organisation is responsible for are, one, offered by intermediaries, so they're not direct government to citizen, and secondly, they tend to be optional services, not mandatory. So we have a lot of questions about how we make those best of breed, how we engage with people, how we encourage people to use them. One of the challenges for us in government is really about how we transition services from the old world, which is very much face-to-face, bits of paper, to a new world, which is much more about, as we all know, online and much more dismediated services. The way I tend to think of it is that you could draw a graph, okay, where one axis is the complexity of the service, and the other axis is the sophistication of the user. Now, if you're a bank, say like a merchant bank or something, your users will be highly sophisticated, either in themselves or because they have a third party like an accountant to do it for them. And quite often the services you're offering are actually quite simple. If you look at online banking, actually quite a lot of the services they offer are actually very simple. You're either getting money or you're paying money in. So that's at one end of the spectrum, okay? And that's a really good place to be because your margins are low, your profits are high. Down the other end of the spectrum is where government sits. We tend to have very complex services, and we tend to have a user base who are not sophisticated at all. So how do you tackle that? Well, we've been doing an awful lot of work in terms of changing the channel strategy, moving stuff online, addressing that. We've also been doing quite a lot of work in terms of trying to raise the sophistication of the users. Okay? So things like the very important and very worthwhile work Martha Lane Fox is doing, for example. But the real big challenge is what do we do about the complexity of those services themselves? And that really is a whole area which I think we really need to start tackling. Because if we try and solve the problem only by moving in one dimension, we're really not going to find a proper solution to it.
So the broad question we're looking at with consumer focus is how do you involve users in the design and development of digital public services, which kind of seems simple extension of consumer and user engagement generally. But is that the right question to ask, or do you have to rephrase that, thinking about the complexity issue?
I think there are kind of a number of issues there. One of them is definitely about rephrasing the complexity issue. You know, there's a wonderful picture which shows the services which we tend to offer. So there's a picture of Google, and all there is one box. Okay, you just type in, I want to find something. Okay. You look at a government website or other service websites, they tend to be incredibly complex, loads of boxes, loads of complexity. So we need to do work in the back end. But there's also work about the users as well. What do users actually want? How do we actually work with them to answer the questions? You know, because if you can find a way of taking half the people or half the complexity out of the process, you can save vast amounts of time, money and strain. And one of the other things which is incredibly important, particularly about government services, is that quite often when people are using those services, it's a stressful time, you know. And if we can't make those services stress-free, if we can't reduce the tension and the loading, then we're just making it more and more difficult for people to use them. And I think it's very important that we address that issue as well.
So you really need to understand the way that the services are configured, as well as understanding what works for different users.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, for me, the most advantageous route of doing this is to work with the entire collection of people, the users, the developers, the designers, the systems and service owners, and actually walk through the entire process and actually say, what is it we're trying to achieve, and how do we do it in a way which makes sense to people, works for people, is as simple and as easy as possible.
So you have to take an existing service or a service scenario, get everybody in the room, figuratively or literally, and walk them through it.
Exactly, and you need to do it in such a way that it actually makes people think through their assumptions. You know, and there are various tools you can use to do that, but it's very important to actually get people to work towards a solution which will collectively work.